The auctioneer moved through the yard at a pace that suggested he had already mentally closed the sale before the bidding started. It was a dispersal auction, the kind that happens when a man dies without a succession plan and his estate needs to be liquidated in a single morning. The farm outside Liberal, Kansas had belonged to Earl Tatum, who had run a wheat and grain sorghum operation on leased ground for 31 years before a stroke took him in February. Earl had no children. His nearest relative was a nephew in Wichita who had not been to the farm in 11 years and who had hired an auction company to clear the equipment because the alternative was managing it himself. The nephew had set no reserves. He wanted the property empty and the proceeds in a check by Friday. The Massey Ferguson FID 711 was the last significant piece of equipment in the yard. It had not been the last piece by accident. The auction company's ringman had looked at it the previous day during the preview and made a quiet professional assessment. Flood damage to the cab, seized engine, destroyed electrical system from what appeared to be a combination of moisture intrusion and rodent activity in the wiring harness. The hydraulic system had not been tested because the engine wouldn't turn over. The ringman had positioned the machine at the end of the auction order because he knew what happened when a crowd that had already spent its money watched a damaged tractor go across. The number would be low. Better to get there when the serious buyers had already loaded and left. By the time the auctioneer reached the 5711, the yard had thinned. The two John Deere tractors had sold in the first hour at prices that reflected strong demand and a competitive crowd. The tillage equipment had moved steadily. The grain handling items had drawn good numbers from local elevator operators who had made the drive specifically for them. What remained in the yard when the auctioneer pointed at the Massey Ferguson was a smaller group. The buyers who stayed to the end because the end was where the distressed equipment appeared, and distressed equipment was what they had come for. Walter Grubb had been at the back of that group since 9 o'clock. He was 66 years old. He had spent 40 years working in John Deere dealership service bays, the last 22 of them as a senior technician at a dealership in Meade County, Kansas, that had employed him until a corporate consolidation had eliminated his position 14 months earlier. The consolidation had been handled in the way that corporate consolidations of regional dealerships are typically handled, with paperwork, with HR language about workforce restructuring, and with a severance check that did not reflect 4 decades of accumulated mechanical knowledge walking out the door. Walter had taken the check, cleaned out his toolbox, and driven home to the property outside Liberal, where he had lived for 31 years and where his wife had already begun asking him what he was going to do with himself. He had not answered that question directly. He had built a shop addition onto the existing detached garage, 12 by 24 feet, heated, with a proper lift he had located through a dealer equipment liquidation and purchased for less than a quarter of its replacement cost. He had arranged his tools, which were substantial, along the walls with the precision of a man who has organized tools his entire working life. He had a workbench, a parts washer, a hydraulic press, and a set of diagnostic equipment that covered the major agricultural equipment platforms he had worked on across 4 decades. He had a laptop with service manual subscriptions, and he had, as of the auction morning in March, no particular plan for what came through the shop door. He had come to the Tatum dispersal because dispersal auctions are where a man who knows machinery and has limited capital finds the intersection of low price and high potential. Walter had attended 11 equipment auctions in the 14 months since his layoff. He had bought 3 machines, a used sprayer he had repaired and sold, a loader tractor he had sold to a neighbor, and a hay rake he had fixed and used himself. He had made money on 2 of the 3 and broken even on the 3rd. He was not operating at scale. He was operating at the pace of a man who is figuring out what comes next by doing it rather than by planning it. When the auctioneer reached the Massey Ferguson 5711, Walter moved forward from the back of the group. The auctioneer opened at 500. Nothing moved. He dropped to 400. One hand went up, Walter's. Nobody countered. The auctioneer looked around the yard with the practiced patience of a man who has sold equipment nobody wanted in front of crowds that had already left. He said 400 once, 400 twice. He said sold. Walter paid cash. He arranged transport through a neighbor with a flatbed. The machine was on his lot by 3 o'clock that afternoon. He did not start the inspection that day. He had learned across 40 years of dealership work that the worst time to assess a damaged machine is immediately after acquiring it, when the mind is still running the acquisition math and the eyes are looking for confirmation rather than information. He covered the machine with a tarp, went inside, had supper with his wife, and watched the evening news. The next morning he went to the shop at 7 o'clock with a fresh notebook and began. The cab flood damage was the first thing he documented, systematically, panel by panel. The headliner had deteriorated. The seat was destroyed. The instrument cluster had visible corrosion on the connector pins. The wiring harness through the cab showed rodent damage at 3 locations. Chewed insulation, compromised conductors, one section where the damage was severe enough that replacement rather than repair was the correct approach. He pulled the section and measured it and wrote down the part number. The engine seizure was the critical question, and he approached it the way he approached every critical question, with the assumption that the answer was not yet known and that the path to knowing it required removing enough material to see clearly. He pulled the valve cover first. What he found was not what flood damage typically produces. The engine had not hydrolocked from water intrusion, a failure mode that usually means a destroyed engine, bent rods, cracked block. What he found was an engine that had seized from oil starvation. The oil was present but badly degraded, the kind of degradation that happens when a machine sits for an extended period after a final run with contaminated oil, and the oil film on critical bearing surfaces breaks down over time until the surfaces contact each other and seize. The damage was to the main bearings. The crankshaft had spun a bearing on the number 3 journal. The bore was intact. The heads were intact. The block was intact. Walter sat on his shop stool and looked at the engine for a while. A spun bearing on a seized engine sounds like a totaled engine to most people who hear those words. To a man who has rebuilt agricultural diesel engines across 40 years in service bays, it is a different conversation. The crankshaft would need to go out for grinding. The journal surface was damaged and had to be brought back to a precise dimension before an undersized bearing set could be installed. That was machine work he would send out. The rest of the rebuild was in his hands. He had the tools, the service data, the parts knowledge, and the patience. He did not have urgency, which was the most valuable thing a man rebuilding a seized engine can possess. He called a machine shop in Liberal he had used for dealership work over the years. The shop quoted $340 for the crankshaft grinding. Walter sourced the undersized bearing set himself from a supplier in Wichita, $220 for the full set, correct specification for the ground journals. He pulled the engine down over the weekend, extracted the crankshaft Monday, had it back from the machine shop Wednesday. He assembled the bottom end with the attention to clearance and torque specification that 40 years of this work had made automatic. He started the engine on a Thursday morning. It ran rough for 40 seconds while oil pressure built and the new bearings seated. Then it smoothed. He ran it for an hour at varying RPM, listening for bearing distress. He heard nothing that concerned him. The engine had cost him $560 in parts and machine work and 11 days of his own labor. The electrical repair took 4 more days. The cab wiring harness section that had been destroyed by rodents was a sourced replacement, $340 from a supplier who stocked MFD711 components. The instrument cluster connector pins cleaned with electrical contact cleaner and showed continuity after cleaning. The cab panels and headliner he sourced from a parts machine he located through an online agricultural equipment listing. A 5711 with a destroyed drivetrain and an intact cab located in Oklahoma, whose owner sold him the interior components for $180, including the seat. Walter drove to Oklahoma on a Saturday and was back by Sunday afternoon. The hydraulic system, which he had not been able to test before the auction, turned out to be the best news of the entire project. No damage. The pump tested within specification. The cylinders extended and retracted correctly. The system had been better protected from the conditions that had damaged everything else, by the geometry of the machine and by what appeared to be a functioning cab seal that had failed from the top but held from below. Total parts expenditure to bring the Massey Ferguson 5711 to full operational condition, $1,760. The auction price, $400. Total investment, $2,160, plus Walter's labor, which he was not counting as a cost because the alternative to spending that time in his shop was spending it not in his shop, which was not an alternative he found appealing. He drove the machine out of the shop on a Tuesday morning in early May. The MF 5711 ran cleanly. The hydraulics responded correctly. The cab was dry, the instruments functional, the seat new. Walter ran it across his lot and back and shut it down and stood looking at it for a moment. Then he called a farmer he had known for 20 years, a man named Don Perkins, who ran a wheat operation 12 miles south and who had mentioned at a co-op meeting the previous fall that he was in the market for a utility tractor. Don came over that afternoon. He walked around the machine. He asked what had been wrong with it. Walter told him, in the same complete and direct way he had documented everything, what the auction condition had been, what he had found, and what he had done. Don asked what Walter wanted for it. Walter said $22,500. Don said that was fair. He asked if he could bring it back if anything surfaced in the first 30 days. Walter said yes. Don wrote the check. The machine never came back. What came back, starting 2 weeks after Don drove the 5711 home, was Don's neighbor, who had heard the story and had an MF6S with a hydraulic issue he couldn't get the regional dealer to schedule. Then Don's neighbor's brother-in-law with a different machine and a different problem. Then a farmer from 2 counties over who had driven past the dealer in Liberal without stopping and followed directions to Walter's shop from a man at the grain elevator who had heard from Don's neighbor that there was a retired Deere technician outside Liberal who could work on Massey Ferguson equipment at rates that made sense. Walter had not planned to work on other people's equipment. He had planned to find machines at auction, restore them, and sell them. The first machine had sold cleanly and profitably. The second machine he bought, a flood-damaged MF6S he located at an estate sale in Comanche County for $600, was sitting in his shop awaiting inspection when the neighbor's call came in. Walter did both. He worked on the neighbor's machine and he assessed the 6S. He found in that combination something he had not expected to find in retirement, the same satisfaction he had gotten from the best years of dealership work, without the scheduling pressure, the upsell requirements, the corporate efficiency metrics, and the documentation overhead that the dealership had built around every hour of shop time in the last decade before the consolidation. The work was the same. The conditions were different. The conditions were better. By the end of the first full year operating from his shop, Walter had restored and sold 4 machines and had taken in repair work from 19 farms across 3 counties. He had not advertised. He had a handwritten sign at the end of his driveway that said Farm Equipment Repair and a phone number. Every customer who called had been sent by someone else who had called before them. Walter kept a notebook of every job, machine, problem, diagnosis, parts, labor hours, charge. He kept the notebook the same way he had kept service records at the dealership with the same level of completeness, because a man who has spent 40 years creating the documentation that protects both the shop and the customer does not abandon the practice when the shop is his own. The notebook at the end of the first year showed $78,000 in revenue across repair work and machine sales combined. Walter had expected less. He was not disappointed by more. He was thoughtful about it in the way he was thoughtful about engine clearances. Precisely, without excitement, focused on what the number meant rather than how it felt. What it meant was that the demand was real and the service gap was real, and his position at the intersection of 40 years of mechanical knowledge and a regional dealer network that could not serve the smaller and older end of the market at prices those customers could sustain was not an accident. It was a structural condition. It had existed before Walter arrived at his shop. It would exist after. He had not created the gap. He was filling it. The way a man fills any gap that his specific capabilities are suited to fill, without drama and without a business plan, one machine at a time. The second year came in at $112,000. Walter hired his first help, a part-time arrangement with a young man named Curtis Hale, who had grown up on a farm in Kiowa County and had 2 years of vocational agricultural mechanics behind him. Curtis worked 3 days a week. Walter paid him fairly and taught him the way he had been taught at the beginning of his own career, by doing the work beside him, explaining what he was looking at and why, letting Curtis make the diagnosis and then checking it. By the end of the second year, Curtis was working 5 days a week and handling straightforward repairs independently, while Walter handled the diagnostic work that required depth of experience. The regional Massey Ferguson dealer in Liberal had heard about Walter's shop by the end of the first year, through the same channels that all such information travels in agricultural communities. A customer mention, a service inquiry that referenced Walter's name, a pattern in the dealer's work orders suggesting that a category of customers had stopped appearing. The dealer's service manager drove past Walter's property without stopping, which Walter's wife observed from the kitchen window and reported to Walter without editorial comment. Walter said he expected that. His wife said she supposed so. The dealer principal called in the spring of the second year. He asked Walter if he was interested in a conversation about an authorized service relationship. Walter said he was willing to have the conversation. The dealer principal described the authorization requirements, training certification, tooling requirements, parts procurement through authorized channels, labor rate minimums that the manufacturer required for warranty reimbursement. Walter listened to all of it and asked 2 questions. The first was whether the authorized labor rate minimum was above or below his current rate. The dealer principal said it was above his current rate. Walter said that meant he would have to charge his customers more to comply with the authorization. The dealer principal said the authorization would bring warranty work that offset the rate increase. Walter asked what percentage of his current work involved machines under warranty. There was a pause. The dealer principal said he understood the situation. Walter said he appreciated the call. He did not pursue the authorization. What the conversation confirmed, in a way that Walter had suspected but not fully articulated, was that the authorization structure served manufacturers and dealers in ways that were not identical to the ways it served farmers, particularly the farmers who were his customers, who ran older machines, who were past warranty, who needed competent work at rates that reflected the economics of operations that were not large. The authorization would have changed what he was. He had spent 40 years being what the dealership needed him to be. He was not interested in spending the next portion of his working life being what the manufacturer's authorization required. He went back to the shop and got on with it. By the end of the third year, Walter's shop had generated $142,000 in annual revenue. He had Curtis full-time and had added a part-time arrangement with a retired farmer named Arlen Beck. No mechanical certification, but 40 years of practical knowledge about how agricultural equipment fails in field conditions. That is a different kind of knowledge from service manual knowledge, and equally important to a shop that is diagnosing problems rather than simply executing prescribed repairs. Arlen worked 2 days a week and was worth considerably more than 2 days of his time suggested. The Massey Ferguson 5711 that Walter had bought for $400 was not in his shop anymore. It was working ground 12 miles south on Don Perkins' operation, accumulating hours the way properly maintained machines accumulate hours, steadily, without drama, in the service of a man who knew what he had paid for it and trusted that the work behind it was sound. Walter occasionally saw it when he drove past the Perkins place on his way to a service call in the southern part of the county. He did not stop. There was no reason to stop. The machine was running. His work was done. What had not been done, and would not be done for as long as Walter chose to keep working, was the larger project of filling a service gap that had existed before him and would require his continued presence to remain filled. The farmers who called him were not calling a business. They were calling a man, a specific man with a specific history and 40 years of knowledge that could not be replicated by a sign at the end of a driveway. The reputation was personal, built on the credibility of a man who told you what was wrong with your machine and what it would cost and whether it was worth fixing, and who had been right enough times that the question of whether he was right this time did not need asking. By the time the third year closed, and Walter sat with the notebook and the spreadsheet his daughter had built him, and the full picture of what the operation had become, the cumulative 3-year revenue stood at $332,000. He did not celebrate the number, he noted it. He filed the notebook in the cabinet above the workbench beside the 2 notebooks that had preceded it. He wrote the year and the total on the spine in black marker, the same way he had labeled service records at the dealership for 40 years. Then, he went to an estate auction in Comanche County, where a Massey Ferguson 7S with a destroyed transmission and a sound engine was listed without reserve, and he sat in the back of the crowd while the auctioneer worked through the morning's equipment and waited for the number to get low enough that the math worked in his direction. It did. It always did. For a man who knew what a machine was worth when other people were deciding it was worth nothing. The dealership consolidation that had handed Walter a severance check and cleaned out his toolbox had made a calculation about what 40 years of mechanical knowledge cost to carry on a balance sheet. The calculation had concluded that the cost was too high and that the knowledge could be replaced by the efficiencies that consolidation was supposed to produce. The farms that drove past the consolidated dealership on their way to Walter's shop were the answer to that calculation. They were not a verdict on the dealership. They were a market condition, the natural consequence of a service gap that appeared when the structure built to fill it was reorganized around priorities other than filling it. Walter had not sought the gap. He had simply been the person available to fill it, with the tools and the knowledge and the time and the lack of any particular reason not to. He had paid $400 for the machine that started it. The machine was running 12 miles south, doing the work it was built to do, on a farm whose operator had paid a fair price for it and received a sound machine in return. The man who had restored it was in his shop on a Tuesday morning, with 2 mechanics working beside him and a line of equipment outside that represented 30 farms across 3 counties that had decided his address was the right answer to the question of where to take a machine that needed attention. The auctioneer had called it sold for $400. Walter had decided it was worth considerably more than that. 3 years later, the numbers agreed with him completely.